Hi, I'm William for Aetuts, and this is a demonstration of how to motivate simulated lights with real lights in After Effects. This demonstration is about shooting a real-world object, in this case a crystal illuminated by a match, and compositing that object with stock footage of dramatic fire and using the simulation of similar lighting effects to reveal a logo. This is part 1 of the tutorial. We'll be going over the animation of the translucent object with the lighting effects and the flames, and in part 2, we'll do the logo reveal. And I also want to say that this is my first tutorial ever. So if anything goes wrong, I hope, and just change the opacity to 22%, and you're done. Thanks for watching. Just kidding, here's a preview of what we'll be creating.
This is Fire on the Mound.
Alright, that was vocal talent Steve Rudolph, and he and I, along with composer William Seegers, are doing a project together called Fire on the Mound. It's a podcast novel, and to promote the podcast novel, I wanted to create an animation with the logo and this crystal, which is a story point in the novel, but I'm not a 3D modeler, so I wanted to use a real-world crystal, shoot it with some real-world lights, and then manipulate that in After Effects. So I shot a semi-translucent object against a black drop cloth using my Canon T2i. You can substitute any semi-translucent object, like a small glass, or a bigger glass with a bamboo shoot sticking out. Now when I shot my footage, I just waved a candle back and forth off frame to create the following lighting effect. Now let's go over the assets that this project will be using. The crystal footage we just watched, and this is a photograph of the crystal itself to get some higher detail. So make sure you take a photo of this translucent object you're using from the same position as your video camera. And some grain, we'll be going over that towards the end of the tutorial. And I have some logos, Aetuts logo, and here we have some renders from Particle Illusion SE. Particle Illusion SE is a particle generator with a host of emitter libraries and presets. And I rendered out some mystical elements for the interior of the crystal. Check out wondertouch.com to learn more about particle illusion. There's also a plug-in version for After Effects. And I also have some stock footage, and of course I can't redistribute the stock footage with this tutorial, but just so you know what I'm using, and you can substitute your own. Here are some ash elements. These I originally got from Motion, and we also have some flame from Artbeats. And if you want to know exactly which flame this is, it's RF304. And from Video Copilot, some lens grime. This particular texture came with optical flares, which is also a plugin that I'm using in this tutorial. Other plugins include Shine from Red Giant Software, Trapcode Shine, fantastic, Trapcode Starglow, and Knoll Unmold, which is free. Look at that, real big. And it is used to generate mattes on anything shot against black. It creates an alpha channel, but it's a lot different than using the screen transfer mode or the add transfer mode. Download it, install it, try it out, and you can do some tests yourself and see the difference. And a script I'll be using later for the logo is 3D Extruder, which I got from aescripts.com. It is fantastic, especially if, like me, you used to create all your extrudes in After Effects the hard way using layers that you offset on the z-axis. You can check out these projects at robotica.org. And the thing about 3D Extruder is that it does the same thing, however, it really allows you to drill down and create some really versatile extrusions right in After Effects. Alright, let's start. So I've already dragged the crystal footage into the Make New Comp button to create pre-comp flame in crystal. This is the pre-comp of the crystal footage. I've rotated it and scaled it down a little. And what we want to do first of all is create a matte for our shape. So right click, new solid, and this is going to be 1920 by 1080, and black is fine, and I'm just going to name this matte. And I'm going to bring the opacity down, zoom in, and G on the keyboard, and I'm going to use the pen tool to draw a mask. Okay, so the mask is done. Crank the opacity up to 100%. And I'm going to turn off the matte and select track matte. of the pre-comp, set it to alpha. So we have that isolated, and I am in fact just going to put a 3 pixel fast blur on there just to soften that a little. Okay, I'm just going to change this color to yellow so they're identical. Duplicate that, and I'm going to change the transfer mode to add, and just that increases the intensity just a little bit. Let's go up to effect, color correction curves, and increase the blacks and push the whites. Just get a little S curve going, and you can see the difference there. Just a little bit more strength to the crystal itself. Now let's make another duplication. This we're going to set to color, and let's go over to the effects and presets palette and select fill. Drop that on our color layer, and it defaults to red. You choose whatever color you want. I prefer blue, but since we're going to be changing the color of so many different layers, either with the fill effect or with the tritone effect, let's just create a new null object and make a color control. Let's go up to effect, expression controls, color control, and let's create a blue that we like, and hit E on the keyboard to expose the effect. Okay, we have the color ready. Let's go down to our color, do the same thing with E. Option, click the color attribute, take the pick whip, grab the color from our color control. You can see the expression there, and now we have a blue crystal. And this way we can just change one color and it will change the billion trillion layers that we will eventually have. So let's just turn off the visibility of the color control null, create another null, and call this opacity control, because likewise we will be controlling the opacity a bunch of different layers. This way we can fine-tune the effect by just changing one attribute. We're going to match the intensity of the light that we shined on our object. So let's throw a expression control, slider control, and this will just be opacity, and 100 for the full opacity of the crystal, and 0. So you're lining up the keyframes to coincide with the real world flashes of light. 0 again. Okay, so I've laid out keyframes for this opacity value, just going from 0% to 100 and then back to 0, and with 100% being the brightest spot on the footage for that particular moment. Each of these coincides with the moments where real light hits the crystal. So we have that set up, and now let's work on the magical, supernatural, fantastical elements that go inside our object, which I have these pre-rendered elements. There's the crystal shine interior, and this is the, slide that over, the little fiery type elements. Change the transfer mode on that to add, and position this at the bottom. Scale it up, and if I bleed off the edges, that's alright, because what I'm going to do is take the matte, duplicate it, throw it on top, change the track matte to alpha, and now those particles only emit within the shape. But I don't like the color of the particles, so let's grab the tritone effect, drop that on our particle layer, and I'm going to reveal the color control, and option click on our midtones, grab that pick whip, and drag it up to color. Now we've selected that blue, and you can see it's changed. And to get a little bit more intensity, I'm simply going to select this pairing, duplicate it, and you can see it's much brighter. I like that. Save it. And I'm going to change the particles and their mattes to a color just so I can instantly see what I'm doing. But the particles emit even when there is no light on the shape. So to remedy that, we're going to take advantage of the opacity control, which we just created, by hitting T, bringing up the opacity, option clicking, and grabbing that attribute. And the same for the original. Now you can see no opacity, 100%, and it's interpolating the opacity just as it's interpolating here. Okay, we have those particles emitting from the bottom, but we also want them from the top. So let's select all those layers, the particles in their mats, duplicate that, drag it up, and we want to just rotate these, flip them vertically. I just pointed to the screen and you can't see that. Okay, so bring up the scale attribute with S. Let's unlock these. And this is horizontal, this is vertical. And by simply entering a negative value, they've flipped upside down. Let's move those into position. It's a little hard to see right now because the opacity is so low, but if we move to there we go, a lot easier to see. Now you can also take these particles and do much the same thing, but to save on time, I'm just going to skip that, but feel free to add more kookiness. Now let's add the fire. Grab our art beats. Let's drag it up just beneath the control sliders, and there's all this great fire, but the part I'm interested in is right towards the end there, when this fire leaves that fire isolated. There we go. Right click, select time remapping, set a keyframe, and option open bracket to trim the layer to that position, and find the end and set a keyframe, and likewise option close bracket. Now the idea is to spread this flame out over the course of this illumination. Let's just turn that off. So you could bring up the opacity control, hit U. Essentially we want the time remapping to go from 0 to 0. And simply drag that keyframe to match. Extend that so we get that extra frame. Go ahead and delete that keyframe there and change the transfer mode to add. Turn it on. Now, obviously it's extending beyond the crystal, and the idea that we want to present is that this fire is within the crystal, as though it's being refracted by flames from behind, which we will add later. But by doing this separately, we can have a much greater control over the interior flames. So I'm going to rotate that. Put that right about there. And duplicate one of our mats. Bring that up. Change the track mat to alpha mat. There we go. And now let's copy and paste the tritone from one of our particle layers to the flame layer. And of course that blue, select and hit U, you can see it's linked to our color control. And if you don't like that pure blue, we can just change the blending a little. Now to distort the flame within the crystal, there are several things we can do. We could use DigiFX Freeform, or we could use Mesh Warp. I'm just going to take the easy route and grab Spherize, throw that onto the fire. Make the radius, move the center of the sphere. You can see that. And I'm just going to crank it pretty high, 350. Now I'm going to duplicate the fire and move it to match all of these cases of the real light hitting our object. Alright, so I've gone ahead and duplicated each case of the flame and its mat, and I've retimed their time remapping keyframes to match the illumination range that we've previously established with our opacity control null. Lastly, I've colored the fire layers and their mats purple for organization purposes. The thing is, they're positioned identically, so I'm just going to rotate them, reposition them, and alternate their attributes. All right, let's see where we're at. Now let's introduce that photograph to give us higher amounts of detail within the crystal at key moments, which we just decide arbitrarily. We'll stick it on top, scale it down a little. If you grab one of the mats, we're just going to set the track mat and just eyeball it. Bring up the opacity. We're just going to create keyframes with 0%, 100, and 0% again. And then within these fire moments, just create these arbitrary occasions where we get more detail out of the crystal. And we could change the transfer mode. That might be a little bright. Try screen. And that'll just give us a little bit more readability on the crystal itself. Now we're going to make the fire behind the crystal. First, we're just going to duplicate this comp and change the name like so. Open it up. Let's begin by removing the mats for the fire layers. And all the other layers beneath the fire. Let's turn these track mats off. Let's duplicate the layers, and now the fire is much hotter and everything is timed out just as we want it. Let's create a black solid for the background. And let's remove the Spherize filter from each instance of the fire. Let's bring in now the ash stock footage and put that over all the fire layers. And let's use null unmult. And now scale it down and position it over the fire. That looks about right. And let's copy and paste the tritone and duplicate the ash layer to make it a little thicker. You can see there's ash when we don't want it. So let's bring up the opacity control, and we want to link the opacity to the slider, and the same for the original ash layer. And now we've got ash that comes on with the flame. Now just to adjust the color on this, since this is uniform from top to bottom, and I just want to introduce a little variation, let's make a new solid and name this blue gradient. And we'll come over to the effects and presets palette and find our ramp. Throw that on, and let's, instead of black, let us use the blue from the color control layer. And we'll set the blue gradient layer to color. And now we can bring the white end of ramp point up a little, and that'll kind of desaturate the end here, just so the flame is not unnaturally uniform. And now let's add flares at the top and the bottom that are going to act as if there are strobes just out of frame and lighting our semi-translucent object in the middle. So I'm just going to create a black solid, and I'm going to name this top flare. Come up to Effect, Video Copilot, Optical Flares. Use any flare you want. I already have a preset called Beneath Crystal Flare. I'm going to click OK. Slide that up to top. This flare I like because of this horizontal streak, which we will be bending later. I'm going to set this to add, and let's bring up the brightness and the scale. We're going to link this to the opacity control and just use a little bit of simple math to offset the values that it gives us. So I'm going to option click on brightness, and pick whip the slider. And I'm going to add 10 to this value so that when the opacity slider is at 100, the brightness of my flare is actually 110. And the same with the scale. I'm going to pick whip the opacity slider and subtract 40 from the value. As you see, it's linked to these values, so I don't have to keyframe that individually. Duplicate the top flare, rename it bottom flare, bring up the scale, flip it with a negative value, but actually I wanted that streak on that side as well, so I'm going to unlock the scale attribute, enter a positive number. There we go. Now to bend the flare streaks, let's bring in an adjustment layer, and this is going to be our optics compensation layer. Find that over here, drag it in. We're going to reverse the lens distortion, and you can see a higher value bends out, almost like we're inside a water tank or a cylindrical vessel of some kind. And just do this to taste. I'm going to bring it in a little. All right, I like that. Check that out. Okay, now let's make our composition for flame and crystal. So we're going to combine our flame in the crystal with our flame behind the crystal. Open that up. And let's save the opacity and the color controls, but delete everything else. And then bring in flame behind on the bottom. And over that, flame in. Okay, let's search out there, where the crystal is allegedly completely black, and yet it is not. We want to match the black levels a little bit better. So let's use the adjust exposure control, which only affects our composition and not the render. Add a brightness and contrast and just lower the brightness, just so it disappears. Click once on reset exposure. That looks better. And you can really see this outline we've got here. So let's select effect, matte, simple choker, bring that in a little, and I'm going to reduce the saturation just a tad, 13. Now let's add some glows, but rather than using the glow filter, we're going to duplicate our crystal several times and apply fast blurs. So the one on the bottom, let's change the transfer mode to add. Put a fast blur on there of 100. Let's repeat the edge pixels. The one in the center will be normal. And the one on top, change to screen. Let's add a blur to that one as well. About 50. And reduce the opacity to something like 22. So we're just combining a slight blur with a more drastic blur beneath it. All right, let's make some trap coat shine action. An adjustment layer, shine top, trap coat shine. Change the transfer mode to add, slide it up on top, and we want to use the electric preset. And we don't want the entirety of the image affected by shine, so we'll go into pre-process, click on the mask. You can see the mask is directly surrounding the source point. Let's increase the radius just a little into when fire will shoot into that mask, then it will be affected by shine. Maybe a little bit more feather. Increase our rays. Just play around here. I like that. I'm going to move the source point even higher. Let's see what that looks like off and on. And let's link the opacity to our opacity control. Ta-da! Now we have it flashing. And of course you'll only see it when it's particularly bright, or our opacity of the other layers is at 100%, which is good. Let's duplicate this, rename it bottom, and let's flip it over with a negative 100 value, except the source point is way up on top. So slide it down. There we go. Now we're going to create a blur map. So new solid, and we will call this blur map crystal. Let's throw a ramp on there. And just bring this in a little. I'm going to choose to use black as the area that defines the blur and white where it is not blurry. I'm going to duplicate this, bring up the scale, enter negative 100 value to flip it over, draw a mask over that solid, and I'm going to use the title safe just to center this up. There we go. Let's feather the mask. Let's change this to subtract. And I'm going to make a white solid. For the center area, and quickly draw a mask across the middle. Feather that. Bring in the expansion. Now I want the crystal itself to be primarily in focus, and the ashes and the flame that's swooshing around and the flares to be out of focus. So let's grab the matte of the crystal from another composition. Bring that in, and we'll paste that up top, turn it on. It's black, we want it white, no big deal. And boom. Let's pre-compose the layers we just created. Select them all and hit Command-Shift-C. And let's name this blur map crystal. Move all attributes into the new composition, open the new composition. Let's increase the fast blur, jump back to pre-comp flame and crystal. Make sure the blur map pre-comp is off, turn on the other layers. Here comes a new adjustment layer. Blur map. Let's apply the effect of blur, lens blur. Right away set the depth map layer to our blur map. Change the iris shape to whatever you like. I prefer heptagon. Let's throw up the blur a little. Click invert depth map. There, I like that. It's a little extreme maybe, but we can always bring that down a little. And of course you see the alpha channel showing through because we don't have repeat edge pixels on. So I'll just click. Now I'm having second thoughts about this gradient here. I'm gonna go back in to the blue gradient. Slide that down. Now we're in the home stretch. Let's duplicate this comp. It's number 5. Final. Open it up. And we'll delete this. Delete that. Bring in number 4. Okay, let's add some corner flares. New solid. Make it black. Grab effect. Video Copilot, optical flares. And again, I've pre-created a preset that I like for the corners. Change this to add. And once again, we're going to link the brightness and scale attributes to our opacity control and use a little bit of math to offset the value. In this case, I want the maximum value of the brightness for this flare to be 19. So what's 100 subtract 19? That would give us 81. Forgot the subtraction sign. And the scale. Option click, pick whip the slider, and this maximum value I want to be 390. So we're gonna have to add 290. And I have to slide the position. All right, and I want to color this blue. Bring up the color control. Option click the midtones. And pick whip the color. There we go. Now I'm going to duplicate that for our left side. And all I have to do is move the position like so. And everything is working. So now we're going to add some lens grime, as if every time the light flashes, it reveals to us the imperfections of the lens. So drag a texture in that you want to use for your lens grime. Let's set the transfer mode to screen. And I don't want the entire lens to be dirty, so I'm going to take the pen tool, make a mask, set that to subtract, and increase the feather. Expand the mask a little. I like that. But at full opacity, it looks really cheeseball. So I'm going to bring up the opacity, and I happen to think 22% is sufficient for the maximum opacity of the lens grime. So let's bring up the opacity control. Option click the opacity, select the slider, and we'll subtract 78, which will give us a 22% maximum opacity when the slider is at 100. And I think that's looking pretty cool. It's a little oversaturated. So real quickly, a new adjustment layer, effect, color correction, hue and saturation. Yep, I like that. And let's bring in our grain. I just like the way grain makes motion graphics a little bit more organic. Set the transfer mode to screen, bring that down. I like 22. All right, let's just add a little trap code star glow to our crystal here. Into presets, cold heaven. Okay, let's reduce the individual lengths to 0 except for up and down. That way we have no diagonals on our star glow, but just a vertical effect. So go ahead and increase the up and down values. And I'm going to turn on the pre-processing mask and increase the softness on the threshold. See where the radius is there. I like that. Now let's say you wanted to change this blue that you've applied to all those layers. We have the color control in this composition. We have the color control in this composition. And we also have it in the flaming crystal composition, and so on. So we'd have to change it 3 or 4 times. Why don't we just change the expression so we only have one to change? And rather than finding all the layers in here that reference this control, we'll just change this control to an expression that references the color control in this composition. So we'll bring up the color control effect with the E, and we're going to option click stopwatch. Here's the expression. From left to right, we have the name of the composition, which is 02 Pre-Comp Flame and Crystal. And the layer we're taking our attribute from is the color control layer. And the effect is also called color control, capitalized. And we're taking the attribute from a color box. So now we can just copy that, go into here, option click and paste. Likewise, in this composition. And now every blue that we have is coming from this one composition. I'll just undo that. And let's do the same thing for opacity. So I have linked all the opacity controls in each of these comps to 02 pre-comp flame and crystal, and the expression is just slightly different than the color control expression. Comp 02 pre-comp flame and crystal. The layer we want is the opacity control layer, and the effect is the opacity, and we just have slider for the value. Alright, this concludes part 1 of the tutorial, and I invite you to come back for part 2 and the logo reveal. So long.